Hi everybody, and welcome to the first chapter of Brain and Behavior. The textbook that we are using for this course, and this is a new and updated textbook, is that of Biopsychology, Fundamentals, and Contemporary Issues. This is by Martin Shapiro. And this is a new book that I have chosen that I think will actually be a real asset to learning. It's a little bit more interactive. It's written to be more accessible. And so we're going to start out with this new textbook, and I'm pretty excited. All right. So to begin with chapter 1, this is mainly going to be an introduction. So I do not touch into every single aspect of the chapter. As you will be able to see from your syllabus, we will cover particular sections. And mainly the sections that we cover in the lecture are the ones that you should emphasize for your studying and exam preparations. All right. So to begin, well, we're here to learn about biopsychology and what, like aside from like, okay, well, we have the biology and the psychology. So we know sort of bringing those two words together. And that is really an element, that is really a basic description of what this aspect of this really key critical aspect of preparation for psychology entails. So psychology is really aspects of the study of human behavior, but you can't understand human behavior unless you actually understand some core elements of the human itself and how behavior arises from the human body. Biopsychology is also an introduction into neuroscience, and this has a significant overlap with biopsychology, but it delves much deeper into the brain behavior sort of element, focusing much more on the brain, and it pulls from disciplines that include biology and psychology, but then also aspects of chemistry, physics, genetics, things that would be needed to look deeper into the brain to figure out what is happening in terms of the flow of information in terms of neurons or the flow of information in terms of chemicals. And then you also have sort of the context of which all of this occurs in terms of evolution, aspects of anthropology, medical care, so how we would be able to use the information that we know to apply for human betterment. And then, of course, some of this intersectionality that we're seeing with other disciplines, such as computer science, where we can, where elements of computational approaches and even bringing in aspects of engineering and things like that can be used to solve elements of can be used to solve problems related to some aspects of controlling behavior, potential interfaces between the brain and behavior for when there is, for example, spinal cord disruption, all sorts of things. So I'm really excited to show you this part of psychology. For me, this class was, I think it was called the mind-brain behavior connection or something like that. And I took it at Berkeley as an undergraduate, and it was one of the coolest classes. It happened to have an awesome professor presenting it. I do not claim to potentially be, as good as my undergraduate brain and behavior professor, and had about, very large, wide lecture classes. But come to think of it, I actually have all that stuff now too. So, but I loved the class. It just opened up my eyes to all sorts of these kind of like secrets of behavior that like, oh, this is what underlies this. And, oh, this is how you understand this. And how actually all sorts of things that we really care about our life are affected by our brain and behavior, and those connections, and then how we can use what we would know to, better ourselves, help others. There's so many applications for biopsychology that for anyone who is taking this course, if you keep yourself open, then you will find multiple topics of interest. And I regularly have people who take this course actually reach out to me afterwards to say, wow, that was actually a lot more interesting than I thought. And I learned a lot. And everything from people behind, specific behavioral changes to themselves, changing the diets for themselves, for their children, all sorts of things. So I just hope you really enjoy all that this course can tell you about yourself, others, and the world that you're interacting with and living in right now. All right, so we have a couple of basic approaches to psychology. So at a basic sort of sense, you have this holistic, which is a gaining understanding by investigating big complex interactions or issues. And this is really where it's looking into where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So you're trying to take this whole sort of, like whole perspective, holistic approach. And disciplines of psychology that apply this include social psychology, developmental psychology, industrial and organizational psychology. And something similar across all of these is they operate within a system. Social psychology within these social systems of the world, industrial organizational within these sort of work systems, and developmental within the context of like the structure of the developmental process and its interactions with the world. So you kind of, for those areas of psychology, you need to understand the whole picture to then use to kind of figure out like, okay, what are these parts doing within the whole picture? We care about the whole picture. So let's look at what is impacting this. And then you also, well, backing up just a moment, a key element of the holistic approach is what's known as an emergent property. And this is something that unique and unpredictable that develops from small things working together. One of the most a common example that is being heavily investigated and is of keen interest is consciousness. So we've had this interest in consciousness for quite some time. There's not really these specific consciousness-oriented parts of the brain. And the main theory is that consciousness is an emergent property that is derived from basically sort of these higher order connections, connectivity, like feeling and mental states that arise from all of the individual components and areas of your brain working together. And then on the flip side is we have reductionism, which basically is the opposite. It focuses on the small pieces, and we could try to gain understanding by investigating the small elemental components of a larger process or outcome. And these would include things like genetics, looking at these small components to see, okay, what the effect of this is having on a larger system. And in terms of disciplines, this would include neurobiology, associative learning, which is sort of really an element of sort of cause and effect relationships, where again, you're looking at the impact of these small operations together. And then you also have the field of psychophysics. So these are just some examples, but throughout the textbook, you're going to see a number of approaches that could be classified as holistic, and then a number of other approaches that can be classified as reductionist. And really, neither one of them is necessarily better than the other. You need both to understand what's going on. If you're having your holistic approach, it's kind of taking from this above whole point, but then you also need to meet down with this reductionist to kind of say, okay, well, at some point, the whole picture and the pieces are going to have to come together. All righty. Now, continuing with sort of these approaches of psychology, even for both, and you might be able to see how components of this would ally with the holistic and the reductionist, is that You have also the applied approach within psychology. And so this would be a focus on creating solutions or remedies for problems, really trying to have a direct effect on aspects of the environment or how a person interacts with the environment. Interventions, to help with any sort of behavioral change, those are applied approaches. Creating drugs to treat illnesses, that's an applied approach. And as we mentioned, sort of clinical psychology, any types of interventions, cognitive behavioral therapy, ACT therapy, other types of therapy, or just direct interactions with an individual, or trying to meet the needs of a group of individuals. These would be applied approaches. And then, similar in a sense to sort of this basic like reductionist elements, you have the basic approach. The basic approach is not reductionist by any means, but it's this idea of still coming up with this sort of like looking at these elemental pieces. And the basic approach is looking at these elemental pieces to engage in sort of further discovery of what, these layers of these fundamental pieces, what might be underlying what, theory building about how all of these pieces might interact together. And those types of things would be tested with basic sort of applied approaches. So basic approaches and applied approaches are meant to work together, starting with basic research, looking at fundamental components and mechanisms, and then testing those components and mechanisms to see if they have the effect that you would want them to. So this would be an intervention for physical activity, eating behavior, smoking, sort of anything. And then, testing, okay, these effects on, are we seeing this in people when we're looking at these sort of, are we seeing the relationships that we predict from these basic approaches and seeing them in interacting with people, animals, humans, groups, sort of whatever, population of interest, to see actual change from those applied approaches that reflect the basic research theories and the development of these fundamental principles. Now, we also have a number of subdisciplines within psychology. And I'm going to go through these, fairly quickly because you'll be able to read through these in the textbook, but they're just really great to kind of run through the broad range of disciplines that are connected with biopsychology, that really from taking this course, you'll be able to have some fundamental elements of and be able to build interest in some of these areas, and ideally, or perhaps discovering some newer areas of psychology that you are interested in developing further, or potentially new aspects of all of these have career paths associated with them, and different types of career paths as well. Right, so some of the various subdisciplines, we have physiological psychology, and this is aspects of sort of includes animal models, biology and physiology of behavior, anatomy, chemistry. So really just, okay, we have the psychology behavioral elements, but looking at the physiological systems that are going to underlie those behaviors. And then you have psychophysiology, which basically just uses different approaches. You have human participants, primarily focuses and uses imaging, recording, and it's primarily non-invasive in its techniques, where some of the physiological psychology, which uses more animal models, is characterized to be more invasive. And then you have psychopharmacology, which is the effects of drugs that are going to have these direct effects on the nervous system, and sort of the psychoactive processes that would be investigating in these subdisciplines. And then we're also going to see behavioral neuroendocrinology, looking at hormones, psychoneuroimmunology, looking at psychology of the nervous system and the immune system, because there's actually huge psychological effects of emotion and stress on the immune system. And some of these effects are through hormones, and the effects of the immune system, having excessive stress or imbalances of certain hormones can really affect the immune system, which can increase your chances of getting a number of really debilitating diseases such as type 2 diabetes. And then you have cognitive neuroscience, which is going to actually look a little bit further into direct connections between higher order processes in the brain and behavior. So these are going to be memory, attention, language, decision-making, a number of the things that are sort of on the pathway from basic science to being more applied. And then you have comparative psychology, looking at the different species of animals and how they learn and make decisions. And so that comparative psychology can also, of course, be done for understanding animals, but then also just be done for understanding processes of behavior, development, and some of the underlying mechanisms that are going to be involved in decision making and how memories are used and formed. And then we also have behavioral genetics, the influence of genes on behavior and mental processes. This is largely characterized by twin studies. Then, of course, evolutionary psychology, which is natural selection and evolution of influenced behavior. But keep in mind when you're looking at this evolutionary psychology that it's going to be some of the elements of the past evolution, but also how we are evolving now, because we are still undergoing natural selection, and elements of the environment in the past are heavily influencing our behavior. And these are the types of, these are the principles that would be in place for behavioral change over time that would result in some of the basic elements of evolution. And then we have behavioral ecology. Of course, this is the influence of evolution on animals' natural behaviors. So this could include us, but this also, behavioral ecology can also include the effects of human behavior on the evolution of animals and their natural behaviors. And then you can have ethology that basically studies animal behaviors in their natural environment. And a combination of behavioral ecology and aspects of ethology can be used to examine, for example, how human behavior is affecting the evolution of animals. And we now have animals that are sort of wild animals that basically are starting to kind of domesticate aspects of themselves through interactions with city and sort of rural environments. So, so just understanding all of these processes, like all of these are super essential for how we are interacting with the world. And then thinking about this in these more applied settings, clinical neuroscience, so this is like treatment of neuropsychiatric disorders, mental health, and these are going to be highly, highly important areas because we are currently in a mental health crisis and will be continuing it for quite some time, unfortunately. You can have psychiatry, which is a medical doctor who's specifically trained to work with individuals with neuropsychiatric disorders to help them with therapy and providing them with psychoactive drugs for treatment. And then, of course, we have neurology, medical doctors that will focus on neurological disorders such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, consciousness, and basically sort of treating elements of those conditions as they arise to basically improve wellness and longevity. So we've kind of gone over all of this stuff of actually like why biopsychology is important, all of those disciplines that it's in. It's also connected to other sorts of disciplines like neuroeconomics and things like that, where we're trying to understand sort of the role of the brain in people's and psychology and purchase behavior and financial decisions. So biopsychology is literally in every aspect or component in sort of your life or in elements of your workplace, because it is fundamentally these are the fundamental principles for starting to understand human behavior of others, and also the behavior of yourself. And if you understand the behavior of yourself and the others better, then you actually have greater capacity, greater control over realizing what your body is doing in a particular context and moment. And that greater control is going to help in, or just greater understanding can help at any one moment with sort of saying, okay, controlling your thoughts around like, wait, I'm going to sort of think about how I'm appraising this a stressful event, to being mindful of how you're interacting or like how you're processing information in a stressful situation, learning what types of risk sensitivities you might have for decision making, um, just learning the fundamental pieces of how you learn and some of the associative learning processes that you can actually observe learning in yourself that happens implicitly or more unconsciously. So then you can actually start to say, okay, are my sort of like everyday behaviors, like setting myself up for what I want to learn and do versus maybe I need to change some of these. So biopsychology is in everything. So we've already gone over some of those other subdisciplines, but here are like the other pieces that you wouldn't even like, think of in terms of broader elements. Biopsychology is senses and perception, at a basic sense, like this is how our brain takes information from the world and processes it. So how does it do that? How do we just take information from the environment and process it and then start to give meaning to it? Those are some of the things that you'll learn from here. These things, the sensation and perception will be then sort of taken in, derived meaning, and then, well, we have to come up with cognition and learning and decision making. And what happens when those things go awry in abnormal psychology, or how do they develop in the first place? So these are some key disciplines that many of you are interested in, that have really strong foundation components from biopsychology. And performance in this class is also sort of predictive and indicative of performance in graduate school. And just because some of these disciplines are generally a part of graduate school, so it's a really great class to actually try to sort of flex your like learning muscles and engage in, because you will learn a lot and it will be beneficial. So, and in terms of building on this, you'll learn a lot, it'll be beneficial. This is, again, knowing this information, you will be more effective in applied situations with psychology. For people seeking therapy, to actually just working with people in a managerial setting, in HR, understanding how people's behavior might be impacted um, by certain drugs that they were taking or mental conditions that they have. So all of this information will just help you be better prepared for applied careers or just interacting with people, which is basically, applying the information that you have learned. Now, the textbook and this course will also dispel some myths about the brain that you'll be able to learn a little bit more about in terms of, how we use all of our brain, whether there are actually right brain people or left brain people. There are not. And we do use all of our brain. And we have many senses beyond the five. Well, those are something, you can't go ahead and necessarily say there's a sense until you can, like, those have to have certain, criteria or qualifications for how they are. You have to have receptors for them and how they are processed in the brain. And then we're also, of course, going to cover understanding how drug treatments works and their side effects, because this is an area of really where we need much more critical understanding. And then we're trying to reduce the stigma of those with various neuropsychiatric disorders, including mental health disorders, neurodegenerative diseases, so that knowing what is going on inside the body can really help people understand what behavior means in these sorts of special circumstances. That can be really helpful for everything from interacting with children, any loved ones, family, older adults, all of the information that you learn here from some of these more applied elements can be quite helpful. All right. So sorry, I'm occasionally taking a moment, just as I would in class, to sort of reflect a minute. The other reasons why we need biopsychology is to basically really combat misinformation. That there are beneficial properties to certain practices, but maybe not necessarily remotely as beneficial as advertised. So some of the things that this might be an example of is certain homeopathic medicines. This is not the case, again, a lot of this determines on how some of these are implemented or used. But homeopathy in general doesn't, like how they would go ahead to necessarily test some of the findings and these types of things. It doesn't follow sort of scientific processes, and you can have things like placebo effects. So these are things to be sort of aware of what you can learn about yourself and how you're going to basically identify what are going to have more authentic effects versus what is going to be less predictable and might actually be more due to expectations that you have as a product. So we'll also be learning more about ethical decisions, about science, research, and the future. We have little nice points of the textbook that have these contemporary issue sections. These will be used in some of your participation assignments. And then at the end of each chapter is also just really helpful sort of review content and resources as well. And finally, at the end of my lectures, and they have this at the end of the chapters, we have key terms. And so these are the key terms from chapter 1 that we have basically reviewed. And there are more key terms that are listed for, the whole chapter in the textbook. And I'm basically trying to present the key terms at the end of the lecture to highlight sort of the information that you'll need to focus on in the chapters. So basically, this will primarily be available for you in terms of the slides to download. And so I'm not necessarily going to kind of review these words and restate them, but I just want you to know that these will be here at the end of every chapter for the textbook, and I will sort of like reference them at the end to remind you that you have them. So with that, we are concluding chapter 1, first lecture. And I'm really excited to be recording more lectures for you. And usually I will be breaking them into smaller components for sort of easier processing and studying. But this, just due to the nature of chapter 1, there was a little bit more introductory throughout. So I left it all as one larger section. So ta-ta, thanks, take care, and see y'all later in time for see y'all later when on my next recorded lecture. Take care.